Hi there, Peter Mansbridge, live streaming from the CBC Broadcast Centre in Toronto. So we're in the main building of the CBC here, overlooking the Barbara From atrium. So a special spot. We're up on the 10th floor. We're here to answer your questions for the next little while, or as long as you've got some good questions coming at us. And really what I'm looking for are questions about D-Day. I'm not sure whether you watched any of the ceremonies that took place already today in Portsmouth, England, in preparation for the big anniversary ceremonies that will take place in Normandy tomorrow. Either about D-Day, anything you want on D-Day, especially the Canadian angle. I've done quite a few shows on D-Day over the years, and have been there many times, and was just over there in Normandy a couple of weeks ago for my documentary, which is running tonight at 9 o'clock across the country on CBC Television. It's called The Future of War. So it's kind of hinged on D-Day in the sense that D-Day was the beginning of the end of the Second World War, the last global conflict. And this documentary is about the possibilities, the potential for another global conflict. Could it ever happen? I mean, we've lived with 75 years of peace, which in the history of the world, really, 75 years is an awfully long time for no global conflict. So many of the experts and analysts that I've talked to around the world are saying we have to be aware of that fact, that it's been a long time since one, and we have to be aware of the fact that certain conditions out there could make something potentially happen. So it's one of those kind of documentaries. So let's get to your questions.
Yeah, my first question, Evelyn Mako on Facebook is asking, what were your emotions covering D-Day ceremonies?
A good question, Evelyn. Anybody who goes to Normandy, even whether it's a ceremony or just simply goes to those beaches, it's about an 80-kilometer stretch of sand and beach on the Normandy coast where the Americans landed on two beaches, the British landed on two beaches, one either side of Juno Beach is where the Canadians landed. So 80-kilometer stretch, Canadians were in one specific area about 10 clicks long where they landed on three different beaches inside the sort of Gold Beach area. So if you go to any of those beaches, you're going to be struck emotionally because you've got to recognize what happened on that day 75 years ago tomorrow. 150,000 guys landed and thousands died on that day as they tried to take the beaches and succeeded in taking the beaches from the Germans. In the Canadian situation, 359 Canadians, young guys, were killed on those beaches and inland as they took the fight inside the Germans on day one, on June 6th. 1,000 casualties all told, and in the days and weeks that followed, hundreds more died. There's a cemetery just for the Canadians, a couple of kilometers inland from the water, and there are about 2,000 Canadians buried there. So all of that's sort of kind of floating through your mind, and you realize what happened there and the emotions that obviously drive you as you're walking along that beach. These guys, young kids, many of them, in their early 20s, some in their teens, they got out of those landing craft and they'd been drilled into them by their trainers for months that when you get out of the landing craft, don't stop for anything. You've got to charge up that beach and you got to get to the German installations and take them out. Well, that sounds pretty straightforward, but when you're rushing along with guys you've trained with, guys in some cases you grew up with, some cases your own relatives, and there were brothers in the Canadian operation, and they're running beside you, and suddenly one of those guys who you've known for years, you've been very close to, is cut down by the German defenders and is lying there dying in the sand, and you got to keep going. You got to leave him there. And you think about that, what does that take to have that happen? So that's, one of the thoughts that goes through your mind. It certainly went through my mind every time I've been there, including when I was last there just a couple of weeks ago, walking the beach at night and thinking about what had happened on that day 75 years ago tomorrow. So thanks, Evelyn. Good question.
Speaking of veterans, Emily's on Facebook is asking how old the youngest veteran is. Peter, do you know?
I don't know the exact ages, but I mean, let's do the math. If in 1944, the youngest guy was 18, let's assume that he was 18. So then you've got 56 more years left in that century, so you're up to 66, 74, up to 2000, add another 19, 93. So if they were of legal age at their youngest, 93 years old would be the youngest fella who'd been at D-Day for Canada as part of the remembrances now. Listen, you know, the first one I went to was the 40th back in 1984, and there were lots of D-Day vets, thousands of D-Day vets. Then over the years, I went to the 40th, the 50th, the 60th, the 65th, the 70th, and in each time, you know, we'd lost a lot of veterans. And now we're down to, nobody knows exactly how many D-Day veterans Canada has, but the assumption is it's in the low hundreds that are left. And we're losing some of these guys every week at that age. So it's, you know, it's a special time for those who've gone back again and are going through all the emotions they must go through. As they get back to the beach, they go to the cemetery. But some of these guys are amazing. You know, there were a couple of, I think it was the American parachute commandos, the guys who went in the night before D-Day, would be going in about this time, 75 years ago. They would be taking off from Britain, you know, with the time difference and everything else. They'd be parachuting in the night before to try and set up some situations to make it easier for the landing forces the next morning. Anyway, some of these guys today jumped again in their 90s, which is remarkable. But they did it, and that tells you something about that generation of what were young men who are now old men, but have still got the spirit that drove them in those days as well.
Carew on YouTube is asking, what kind of a role and to what extent did intelligence like spycraft play into the preparation or success of D-Day for the Allies?
Intelligence and spycraft back in the 40s was nothing like, of course, it is now, but it did play a role, a very critical role. In the run-up to D-Day, there were lots of intelligence flights over the Normandy beaches. They had to be careful because they were trying to convince the Germans they were not going to land in Normandy, they were going to land in the Pas-de-Calais region, which is kind of the closest area from Dover to Pas-de-Calais. And they were successful in doing that, but nevertheless they still had to investigate those Normandy beaches. So you had flights going over, taking pictures to find out exactly where the different German installations were, to pick the exact spots they wanted to land for each of the countries, the Brits, the Canadians, and the Americans. But they also had commandos going in at night by sea in the months leading up to the invasion to check out things as close as they could get to finding out. And then they had French, who were resistance fighters, who were supplying information as well. So spycraft, not in the way we think of it today with drones and cyber and you name it, but very hands-on, human-controlled intelligence factors. Much of them proved to be incredibly accurate, some of them not so much, which caused obvious problems for the invading forces. But there was intelligence, just not like the kind we think of in today's world.
Alex Brockman on Facebook is asking, how will our remembrance of D-Day and World War II change as those veterans pass away? Will we be feeling the same in 2044?
Yeah, for the 100th anniversary. Well, look, I was at the 100th anniversary of Vimy a couple of years ago. and in 2017. And the memories were incredibly strong still, even though there were no veterans still alive. Their stories have been passed down from generation to generation. We had a lot of these fellows from the First World War on tape, both audio and video, and we were able to play back their remembrances. And here it will be even more so. They'll last forever, their memories. And here's what's important. You know, as I said, I was born right after the Second World War. So I grew up through a generation. My dad had fought in the war. He was in the RAF. We were British. I was born in Britain. He was a Lancaster crew member. And but we grew up at a time when veterans, no matter whether they're the Air Force or the Navy or the Army, tended not to talk about it, the horrors they'd seen. I mean, when I talk about what happened on that beach, I mean, what these guys saw, they didn't want to talk about when they came home. They had a really difficult time adjusting to a life without bloodshed and horror around them every day. And so they didn't talk. And it went through a number of generations. I remember I couldn't get my dad to talk about it until, you know, much later in his life, when I'd shown an interest beyond just questions, but an interest by reading about what had happened. But as the generations carried on, a lot of these fellows who had fought felt it was their obligation to talk about it to younger generations, so they understood that war was not a glorious thing. War was an awful thing. There was a reason for it, and there was an absolutely solid, good reason for the Second World War. But they wanted to pass down the awful nature of what had happened, and so they started talking about it. And many of them talked about it into television cameras and audio recorders. And so their memories would live on. Many of them started going to schools, and that still happens with some of the veterans who are still capable of going to school, and they going to schools and talking to young people about what they had experienced. And we're lucky that we were able to capture their memories. So, you know, in 2044, we'll have those memories. None of these guys will still be around. They'll all be gone by then. But we'll have their thoughts and their memories to remember, and the lessons learned from what they went through.
Alexander, being on Facebook, asks, do you think people today are a bit more sophisticated when it comes to propaganda? Do you think that this means that the military finds it harder to make war?
Does that question come in on Facebook?
Yeah, from Alexander.
Okay, Alexander, it's a good question, but it's interesting you're writing that on Facebook, because are people more sophisticated in understanding propaganda? Well, they may well be now. I'm not sure whether sophisticated is the right word, but they're more questioning now. I mean, look what we went through in the last few years of how Facebook was manipulated by the Russians and by other countries as well on the U.S. experience. And we're still learning every day more about what happened there and how it happened and how we can prevent it. And certain social media streams are being responsible and trying to ensure it doesn't happen again. But we're not there yet. It still can happen. So being sophisticated, in my view, being sophisticated is being challenging. Is about vetting the sourcing of what you're reading and what you're seeing. We live in an information age unlike what it was 5 years, let alone 75 years ago, 5 years ago. There's so much information available. You know, we live at a time where there's more information available now, you know, on your phone than has ever existed before in the history of the planet. And some of that is garbage. You know, it just belongs in a sewer. But not all of it does. And it's up to us to distinguish what's real and what isn't. And that's a challenge. And that's all a part of, you know, trying to deal with the the complexities of today's modern information age, and understanding and appreciating that there are those who are trying to manipulate it for their own cause. It could be another country, it could be a company, it could be any number of different things. And so, we have to recognize that and be challenging and, maybe suspicious is not the right word, but we need to ensure that we're checking and we're cautious about accepting everything we see.
Jonas Piva on Facebook asks, you just spoke to the horror and the terror and some of the more bitter realities of war. Can you speak to any sense of value and triumph in it? Having been there, what were the positives, if any, were for you?
Well, listen, the positives were we crushed the evil that was Hitler. You can't get much more positive than that. That's what, that era, the late 30s and the early 40s was a time in which the countries that were part of the Allied coalition banded together, many from, different, countries from different backgrounds with different ideas and different philosophies, different ideologies, but they banded together in a common purpose, a unity of purpose, to crush the evil of fascism and in particular Adolf Hitler. So to be able to do that, they had to trust each other, even at a time when some of them were very, very different in their ultimate goals. But they did trust each other. And then not only did they trust each other and win, they then sat down together and said, we can't let this happen again. We need to take that same unity of purpose that we had during the conflict and apply it to ensuring there's a lasting peace. And to do that, they banded together and started certain institutions. The United Nations, the World Bank, NATO, and others that ensured for decades that in fact there would be global peace. We've had regional conflicts, no question about that, and some serious ones that cost a lot of lives. But in terms of the greater war, like a World War III, that hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because of that unity of purpose. Now the question is, and that's what my documentary tonight is about, and I hope you either have a chance to watch it. I know it's tough. It's 9 o'clock tonight. There's a game going on. The guy's, bouncing a ball at the same time. So I can understand if that's what you watch, but that's what PVRs are for, right? Use it. The Future of War on CBC tonight at 9. We're also going to put it up on Jam, and it's also going to be available on News Network over the next couple of days as well. But that's what the documentary is about. It's because those organizations in some cases have been fraying, and that unity of purpose by a certain set of countries doesn't look as solid as it did 10 years ago. What does that mean for the future? Could we end up in another global conflict, either by design or by accident? So we look at that in a new era of potential battlegrounds, a new era of weapons, cyber, AI, all of this. We look at it in this hour-long documentary that's, I'm very proud of it. I mean, obviously anybody who's trying to promote a documentary will tell you it's great, you got to watch it. This is important. And that's why I'm not worried if you choose basketball tonight. I probably will choose basketball tonight. But I've actually seen it already, the documentary. But nevertheless, find a way to record it or make the time to watch it later when it's on in one of its other airings. Because it is important. And it is something you want to share with your family, with your kids. It talks about the future and the possibilities with some really smart people. They're not sort of conspiracy theorists. These are real smart people who talk about what's happening out there and what could happen and what we have to be careful of and why we shouldn't be complacent. So all of that's in this.
David James Wang on YouTube is asking, what was the most shocking thing you learned while filming this documentary?
Well, that's a good question. These are all good questions. What was the most shocking thing I learned? Well, I guess it's this, it's this move towards the new technology in weaponry. Some of this isn't new. Cyber was used in Ukraine by the Russians a couple of years ago. They knocked out the power grid in Kiev. Did they do it for a reason in that conflict? Or did they do it to send a signal to everyone else that they have the power to do that? And if they have the power to do that in a city, could they do it in a country or a series of countries? That's an important question. They also used cyber to the same conflict in Ukraine, where they targeted, it's called micro-targeting, they targeted individual cell phones of Ukraine soldiers. And they got messages to them in some, pretending that they were that soldier's girlfriend and that she was breaking up with him. This is in the middle of a battle, and how that could have an impact on the emotions of that particular soldier. Now, this was all testing out possibilities. So that's pretty interesting, scary stuff. The increasing use of drones and the question of who controls them and whether there should be always a human in control of drones, or whether we have autonomous drones that make their own decisions about targets and when to hit them and when not to hit them. That debate is going on and exists in some countries in the world, not just the potential enemies. So all that kind of stuff, plus the emerging power. I mean, we've talked about it for years, but we never sort of thought about it in terms of, potential enemies. But the emergence of China as an enormous power, not just on the economy, but with its military, and what its plans are for the next decade or two, and how those may conflict with the plans of other countries, namely the United States. So you have that kind of stuff going on. But here's the scariest, the thing that really made me sit up. I was talking to Graham Allison, who is a professor at Harvard University and extremely well respected by countries around the world, used to brief defense policy analysts from China to the United States, from Moscow to London. So he's been around, knows his stuff, very well respected. I was talking to him, and I said, so we talked about a lot of these things that I've just mentioned here, and I said, what do you think about the potential for a World War III? Could it happen? And he said, as they all said, of course it could happen. Will it happen? In his view, a 1 in 3 chance in the next decade. Now, that made me sit up. 1 in 3 chance? Those aren't great odds in the next decade. So, your question's a good one. You watch, when you get the opportunity, this documentary, and you tell me what your moments were. Maybe nothing will phase you in it. Maybe it will. I'd love to hear about it.
Christine Ashcroft on Facebook says, my great uncle died that day on the beach, from what she's been told. But how can we go about getting information, maybe even photos?
Listen, we're lucky. There's quite a visual library from D-Day. There were some brave journalists who landed on the beaches that day with the Americans and the British and the Canadians. In many cases, it was mostly still shots, but there's some video. One of the best video shots of an actual landing under gunfire was from the Canadians, and it's used by them all, by the Brits and the Americans, as if it was like their moment. It's not, it's a Canadian one. But most of the film that was shot that day, whether they were stills or moving pictures, it got destroyed in the water. Either the photographers or were shot or fell into the water, and stuff was destroyed. So there are not a lot of images of the actual moments of the initial landings. Lots of pictures. When you see pictures from D-Day that were shot on June 6, 1944, but when the guys are kind of casually walking up the beach, well, that's after the heavy duty fighting has taken place and the landing sites have been secured and the troops are moving inland. It's when you see guys hiding, you know, those cross iron bars that sit along the beach. Those are there to try to prevent the landing craft from getting in. When you see guys huddled behind there, that's happening right during the moment, you know, right during the heaviest of the fighting. That's the only protection they had. There's sadly lots of pictures of bodies lying on the sand or floating in the water. I mean, the horrors that were at Omaha Beach, one of the two American beaches, Utah and Omaha. Omaha was a slaughterhouse. If you saw Saving Private Ryan, it's generally regarded, the Steven Spielberg film, as the most realistic of what it was like on that day. And the opening of Saving Private Ryan is, you know, it's about 25 minutes long, and it is just staggering. You feel every moment of it. And it, you know, veterans who've seen it say that's exactly what it was like. So, I mean, but your basic question about film and the history of that day, there actually is, in spite of all the problems of saving some of the work that was done that day by journalists, there's a lot that is available. And if you go online, just punch in D-Day, visuals, pictures, you'll see lots of stuff. I was just looking at stuff today online, and I've spent 35 years looking at these things. And I saw stuff that I had never seen before. It was a tweet, I think, from Politico magazine that offered up 25 or 30 stills from D-Day, and some of them are quite gripping, but many of them I had never seen before. So there's lots out there.
We're running out of time with you, Peter, but Gary Eduono on Facebook is asking, have you ever jumped out of a plane on a D-Day reenactment?
Only in my dreams. I'd need a lot more courage to do that. But I've certainly watched some reenactments, and I've, you have nothing but admiration. As I told you earlier, these two old guys who jumped today, who jumped 75 years ago, reminded me of the late President George Bush, who, as you may recall, was in the Pacific Theater of War and was shot down from his plane, had to parachute, and was picked up by a U.S. sub. He was lucky. First, he lived through the shoot down. Second, he lived through the bobbing along in the water. And third, he lived to be rescued by an American submarine as opposed to a Japanese vessel. But he, when I think it was on his 90th birthday or somewhere around there, jumped again. You know, he was strapped onto some guy, some current paratrooper, but he still did it. He did it. It was remarkable. But no, I haven't done it. I'd love to tell you I have, but I haven't.
Okay, one last question, I think, before we have to wrap up. We'll give it to Hideki Daly on Facebook, who asks, is there any history of the women's role in D-Day?
Well, listen, women were incredibly important to the days that immediately followed D-Day, whether they were dealing with those injured who were brought back from the beaches, or whether they were those who were brought in as soon as the beaches were secured, like my aunt, Dorothy Jameson, who just passed away a couple of years ago, who was one of the first women RAF personnel who came in to help set up the airfields that the RAF and the Americans used for landing spots inside Normandy. Listen, the role of, women may not have been on the beach holding guns, running up the beach to take over the Nazi installations, but they were behind so much of the success of that day, whether it was in factories, across our country and others, helping build the machinery of war, whether it was in the intelligence area. There's a great story online today at CBC.ca about a woman who worked with the French resistance to help those who were coming ashore on D-Day. And then there were women in these major support roles, whether it was in terms of hospital medical care, or whether it was in terms of setting up airfields and and other key spots. But on the actual day of on the beaches, I do not believe that there were any women involved on that day.
All right, maybe you want to give them a little more information.
Promotion about tonight? Yeah. Okay. Listen, this has been great, and as always, when I've done these things, the questions have been, terrific, and I really appreciate hearing them. Keep in mind all our coverage over this next 24, 36 hours on the D-Day ceremonies, the 75th anniversary, from France and from here in Canada. It was an incredibly important day in the history of the world, in the kind of world that we live in, the peace that was achieved starting in that conflict, and especially on days like D-Day, we've lived to benefit from. And so understanding our history and the men and women who were so instrumental in ensuring that that was successful is important for all of us. So watch those programs, and if you know a vet, speak to that vet, listen to that vet about the lessons. And finally, aside from all that, there is a documentary tonight at 9 o'clock, The Future of War. Myself and my team that I work with, or I'm lucky enough to work with, have spent much of the last couple of months preparing this and interviewing these really key people around the world. So it's on at 9 o'clock tonight on the CBC network, the main network. I appreciate that for many of you that's in conflict with something else that's happening on television tonight. So set your PVRs or look for the times. We're still sorting them out as to when we'll air it on CBC News Network. But it's also going to be on CBC Gem. And if you don't subscribe yet to that streaming service, you can do it for nothing. You should, because there's lots of stuff there available. Under the documentary section, you will find The Future of War. And so you can watch it anytime.
And there's a lot of people there in the comments wishing you a happy retirement and saying they miss you so much. So
that's very kind of you. And it's kind of semi-retirement, because I'm still doing projects like this, a lot of fun to still be involved in journalism, and I'm teaching at the University of Toronto, and I'm doing a lot of different things, so it's not like I'm sitting on a porch somewhere in a rocking chair. Not yet, but it won't be long. Thanks.